Good afternoon, class. This is John. Checking in. Wanted to put some finishing comments together for our focus today on the Ming Dynasty of 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th century China. The Ming are going to last from 1368 to 1644. So they bridge an almost 300-year period, and we're going to try to just further highlight some of the practices and institutions that the Ming called upon to essentially reassemble and reignite China in yet another period of dynamic growth and global power as really the leading cultural sphere throughout much of this period. Probably sharing the stage a little bit with the Ottomans. So we spent the early part of our time today talking about the Mongols and trying to understand how their conclusion was really sort of a revealing glimpse of some of the ethnic issues that had long simmered within Chinese society. In some ways, ethnic tensions and ethnic differences that still are an important part of the politics and social order of Chinese society even today. We talked about how this important peasant by the name of Zhu Yuanzhang was instrumental in the formation of the Ming Dynasty, some of the sort of basic guidelines that he followed, and then also some of the principles or organizing concepts upon which the Ming Dynasty will be based. We left off talking about how Ming China occurred at an interesting moment in world history, and I was talking about how we're soon to this agricultural revolution, but part of the changes that are happening within Ming society are the consequence of changes and innovations and breakthroughs that had happened in East Asia, such as this new strain of Champa rice, which is going to allow for greater productivity, greater surplus. Greater surplus of food is going to drive a growth in population. And this growth in population, which is very much tied to the food supply and the carrying capacity of China's geography, is going to help the Ming transition to a more sophisticated and specialized economy. Part of that is happening just in the region of East Asia, but the other important development here is that during the Ming Dynasty, this is the time when Western European countries start to quote-unquote discover the Western Hemisphere. And so as a result of that, we can call this the Columbian Exchange. There's going to be a tremendous exchange going both ways, from Europe to the quote-unquote New World and from the quote-unquote New World back to Europe. And that's going to be, in many cases, in many ways, a focal point of next week's discussions when we get to the Age of Discovery and the content evident in Chapter 12. So, needless to say, this drives a tremendous population surge, which has all sorts of consequences for the Ming government, the Ming economy, and Ming culture as a whole. So one of the things that you probably picked up on in your textbook reading was that the Ming, after a century or so of interruption due to Mongol rule under the Yuan dynasty, I don't know if I got a chance to say this in class last week. I think I did say it on a screencast. But the Mongols practiced a form of rule known as diarchy, where they would pair Mongol people of the ethnicity Mongol with other ethnicities. In some cases, they would be Han individuals. Other cases, they'd be Europeans or other who the Ming would have referred to as inner barbarians, meaning members of nearby ethnicities and societies. But the idea was the Mongols had to sort of spread themselves thin because there weren't enough of them to effectively take over and rule for themselves. So that's one of the ways they do it, is through this process of diarchy. Well, the Ming, when they restore power with the help of Zhu Yuanzhang, they are going to reintroduce the civil service exams with a little bit more of they're going to become even a little more developed and specific. The 3 different levels of exams becomes particularly apparent during the Ming Dynasty. And this is going to fuel a dramatic expansion of the Ming bureaucracy. And in your SNAP assessment for today, it's possible that you called attention to this because both the Ottomans and the Ming are going to have pretty astonishing bureaucratic systems. I would argue that in the case of the Ming Dynasty, it's far larger. There are far more individuals involved, and it's far more regulated by the emperor. But the Ming bureaucracy becomes something that's certainly of note. Also, again, as a consequence of Western European countries, quote-unquote, discovering the New World, we're going to start a really subtle yet absolutely instrumental development in world trade relationships. Because during the Ming Dynasty, the government starts to introduce a new requirement that the Ming citizens pay their taxes in silver. You might recall from reading last chapter, I believe it was chapter 10, where your textbook talked about flying money and the use of paper notes in different parts of the global trade networks. Well, the Ming decide that they are not comfortable with the lack of backing and value behind currency. So they switch in a really, I'd call it a failed experiment, but they switch to silver to back their currency. And this is going on during the 1500s. And at first, the Chinese rely upon Japanese silver mines to meet their newborn or newfound need for silver to help underwrite and support their economic transactions. You can imagine if, as a farmer or a merchant or a porcelain producer in China, if suddenly the government decrees you must pay, thou shalt pay in silver, this is going to drive a tremendous demand. And so Japan is the first place to serve as a supplier of silver to China. But then a tremendous amount of silver starts flowing into China by the late 16th century. The Manila galleons, which are essentially these ships that the Spanish send across the Pacific Ocean from Spanish Mexico all the way across the Pacific to the Philippines, where silver and other goods are going to now be moved into the Chinese economy. And this is really important because this gives European merchants, starting with Spaniards, their long-awaited trade item that's going to allow them to enter into the realm of Chinese trade. Remember that Middle Kingdom, that almost arrogance of, we don't have anything to benefit from the outside world, we're not interested, we don't need it. Well, the Spanish trade of silver is going to be a long-awaited entry that Europeans can make into the Chinese trade network, a way to access Chinese silks, porcelains, Chinese cotton, Chinese paints, Chinese paper, all these really important trade items. So this will be a really important factor. The silver flows in such abundance, however, that it creates inflation. And those of you who know a little bit of your economics or your Econ 101 know that inflation is essentially when you have more money chasing the same amount of goods and services. If there's no expansion of the economy to go along with the expansion of the currency that's being used to carry out transactions in that economy, it's going to start to result in inflation. And inflation is a real problem. It's not something that a government or an economy can handle and endure for very long. So that becomes a real problem. And it won't be too long thereafter where there starts to become a pretty evident Chinese withdrawal from its global relationships. It will still have some relationships with its inner barbarians, but the outer barbarians are something that China has much less and less interest in carrying on a relationship with them. By the 17th century, toward the end, in the final decades of the Ming Dynasty, which comes to a conclusion in 1644, there's going to be greater and greater evidence of corruption. And this, of course, is not too unlike, we see this pretty regularly in Chinese history. The beginnings of dynasties tend to have highly disciplined, highly hands-on, highly controlling emperors who are just paying attention to every little detail. However, by late in a typical Chinese dynasty, the successors, those who have usually received their position by hereditary means, it's almost as if they've forgotten the sacrifice and toil and challenge that helped make that dynasty great in the first place. And so there is going to be evident corruption by the late 17th century. I want to spend just a little time talking about one of the truly remarkable phenomenon of the Ming era, probably right along with the Great Wall, which undergoes tremendous restoration and rebuilding. But Zheng He, who we talked a little bit, under the young Lo Emperor, who is the third emperor, I think I have that right, the third emperor of the Ming era, Zheng He is going to take advantage, well, it's not just him, the Ming dynasty, the Ming leadership is going to take advantage of some dramatic processes that have been going on. For example, the earliest Ming emperor, Zhu Zhuang, he planted what we think are probably about 1 billion trees within China, and this was an effort in part to increase the wood products of China. Of course, China was dependent upon paper, so it had need for wood, but it also had need for construction. And of course, wood is a very important ingredient at this time to any construction happening. So there was tremendous tree planting that happened, and lo and behold, it would be this reforestation program that would help build the later merchant marine and naval fleets that would serve the Zheng He expeditions. So China was, in the early 1400s, very intent upon going out and using its power to sort of further strengthen its hold on the global order. And so one of the ways that this happened was through a series of maritime tours undertaken largely by the Muslim eunuch Navy captain Zheng He. And he's a fascinating individual. We talked about him a little bit in class, but he leads a real, the Chinese Navy at its height has him as its leader. They tour, as this map suggests a little bit, I think. Actually, though, as I'm reading it, yeah, it shows Zheng He's expeditions from 1405 to 33. But by 1435, somewhat astonishingly, China begins to turn inward. It loses its curiosity or its interest in having a global role. This is tied in with that concept of the Middle Kingdom, this idea that China really didn't feel like it had a whole lot to benefit from those parts of the world beyond China. And this creates, for China, an unfortunate missed opportunity, because it will be just decades later that the Europeans, starting with the Portuguese but continuing with the Spanish and the Dutch, start to round the Cape of South Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, and begin penetrating the Indian Ocean trade network, and also start creating some real challenges for China. Jesuit missionaries begin a presence that starts a slow process of conversion of some Chinese to Christianity. Over time, this works for the Ming Dynasty, but by the Qing era, as we'll see later on in the course, the Qing start to expel Christian missionaries. Let me just quickly show you these other developments of the agricultural revolution. You can stop here if you need to, and the commercial revolution. And with that, we'll call it good. All right.